What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the You Know Ball podcast. I am your host, Troll Bro Dude, and today we have a lot of things going on. We have Slop Fest coming up 2 weeks away from the NBA trade deadline, so we're stepping things up over here. We're going to be streaming 7 hours that day throughout the trade deadline, reacting to all the slop that drops that day in the NBA. That will be sponsored by our sponsor, Underdog Fantasy, the newest and best place to play fantasy sports and win big prizes. And before then, the next week, we have one more week for our slop season contest. You can sign up today using our promo code SLOP on Underdog. And then from there, you'll get a $100 deposit bonus, and you can win up to $500 by guessing which player will end up where after the trade deadline. So you have one more week. It ends Thursday, February 2nd. So please be sure to sign up for that as well. The link is in the description for all of this, as always. And then we'll be doing our fantasy draft for the NFL playoffs. It's championship weekend. The Birds are in the NFC Championship game. So we'll be doing a fantasy draft. You can also use their pick'em to go higher or lower for yards on your favorite players in those games. And then you could do it with the NBA games as well. So if you have not already, sign up with the promo code SLOP, $100 deposit match. And then you can join the slop season contest and do their pick'em in the fantasy draft. And it's great. It supports the podcast, keeps the partnership going, all of that fantastic stuff. In addition to that, we also are streaming during Jokic versus Embiid on Saturday afternoon for the MVP, basically a big narrative game. We'll be streaming on playback. So you can follow that link in the description as well to watch the game with me. We've been getting a lot of people going in there. It's been a ton of fun. We did one for Ben Simmons' return to Philly in the Nets game. We also did one for the Celtics Heat game the other night. Unless there's any sort of major trade or anything that happens, this will be the last episode of this week, and then we will be back early next week. So enjoy this episode. Subscribe to the Patreon for the full episode if you would like. And yeah, so check all of that stuff out now. Thanks. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the You Know Ball podcast. I am your host, Trill Bro Dude, and today we are going back to our roots here on the You Know Ball podcast, going full sicko mode on the Sixers trade deadline. This is kind of what the podcast started as, and for this episode, we have two of my favorite guests to have on. We have Jason Timperley. Jason, what's going on?
Yeah, not much, Trill. Just looking forward to trade deadline. Ready to go.
Yeah, I mean, we are here together to try to scrounge together some things that we can do over the course of the next week or two as we lead up to the deadline. And we also have Bryan Toporek here from Liberty Ballers, Bleacher Report. You know him from a bunch of different places. What's going on, Bryan?
Thank you for having me, Jason. Glad to finally see you instead of just going back and forth on Twitter over the years. Happy. There's been such a dearth of slop in our lives for the Sixers this year, which is just not how we do things. So I'm happy that we're going to scrounge up our own slop today. I'm excited.
I know that's the thing, is that we have to create the slop because we've gotten so little. And it actually, outside of the Ben Simmons drama, it is kind of in Morey's nature since he's been here to not really leak things. His history so far, and we'll dive into that a little bit deeper later, but his history so far with the Sixers at the deadline specifically is kind of waiting until the week of to see what the best offers are out there, what they can realistically get. I remember 2 years ago when they were saying that they were interested in Norman Powell and George Hill and Kyle Lowry and Lonzo Ball. That was the week of the deadline. So I think in the next week or two, we will get some more information about who the Sixers could realistically acquire. But let's dive directly into that kind of stuff, which is basically, what do the Sixers realistically have to trade at this deadline? Because this is probably the most quote-unquote asset poor that they've been since Morey's been here. They don't have flexibility with any future first-round picks. They have sent out so many, getting off the Al Horford contract. So OKC has that one. In the James Harden trade, they sent out their 27 pick and then protected it in 28. So they technically can't even trade their 29 first right now. So right now, they're so limited in terms of future firsts that they basically only have one pick that people would see as somewhat valuable, and that is the Hornets' second-round pick in this upcoming draft, which is essentially going to be a top 3 or 4 pick in the second round, which some teams could view as, you know, maybe if they had some other ammo, they could move up into the late first, or maybe they could view some guy in that range that they view as a first-round talent that they could get there. So as far as picks go, that's really the only valuable pick that they have. We just saw in the Rui Hachimura trade, 3 second-round picks can get you at least a rotation player in Rui. And then you have the fact that they have Matisse Thybulle, Paul Reed, and Shake Milton all on expiring contracts. Now, the issue that we run into here is that Thybulle and Shake have been huge rotation players for them this year. So a lot of these trades that you could come up with, you're giving up some of your rotation. And also, these guys might be at a lower point of their value due to the fact that they are on expiring contracts. So, Bryan, why don't you tell us, do you think that they have anything else that would be seen as like valuable at this deadline? Or is that kind of it as far as any sort of trade pieces that they have?
So I just wrote about it at Forbes, actually. I mean, I think they're going to go one of two ways. They're either going to go like marginal minor upgrades just because they are so top heavy in terms of their salary structure and they're limited in how much they can take back in a trade. So if they're not sending out Tobias Harris is the one big name to monitor, but PJ Tucker, DeAnthony Melton, who should be effectively untouchable barring like a major blockbuster. Furkan Korkmaz is like their highest paid trade chip at $5 million. Then Matisse, Daniel House, George Niang, who's also expiring. So they're limited in like the types of players that they can even target if they're not sending out Tobias. If they are sending out Tobias, that opens up anyone at that point because he's $37.6 million. And you mentioned the second round picks. Like it'd be pretty cool if the NBA didn't strip them of 2 second round picks for tampering with Tucker and with House. But yeah, I mean those two are gone. They owe a second in 25 to OKC. They owe a second in 26 to OKC, Miami, or Houston. So they only have 27, 28, and 29 to offer. So like you might as well just say they can offer almost no pick outside of the Charlotte one or like a very, very distant second. But I think Matisse is probably if they're not going to trade Tobias, he's probably the biggest inflection point of, if you're not planning to re-sign him this summer, when he's a restricted free agent, much like what we just saw with the Wizards and Rui, it makes sense to trade him now, but you hit at the big dilemma here. The Wizards aren't going to win anything this year, so who cares? They gave up Rui, and fine, they get 3 seconds. That's great. If the Sixers are giving up Thybulle like for 3 seconds and a crappy player who's not going to be in their rotation, that runs counter to the win now plan that they are very clearly trying to pursue. So it is a very delicate balance to thread.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the lack of assets is really the unfortunate part for the Sixers right now. They're pick poor. All of the players that we discussed, even a guy like Furkan Korkmaz, like Korkmaz has $5 million in salary next year. House has $4 million in salary next year. If a team doesn't view those guys as like positive rotation players that they can plug in right now, you might have to pay just to get off of that. You might have to include that Hornet second just for that to be a neutral trade for another team. So that's another, or maybe if a team really likes Thybulle or Paul Reed, who are 2 guys that are on the fringes of the rotation and in and out dependent on certain matchups. But also, we know that we can't trust Montrezl Harrell in the playoffs, even though our coach and possibly GM think that you can. And then we know that Thybulle has his own issues in the playoffs, despite the fact that we're so bad on the wing that we kind of need a guy like him. So, Jason, let me ask you this. If you were in Daryl Morey's shoes, how would you approach this deadline? Because I think that I have my own idea on this. And then I think that there is a perception of what he should do and what he actually can do. But what would you do if you were in Daryl Morey's shoes with like these limited picks, limited players, and then kind of looking for some sort of upgrade?
Yeah, so I'd be trying to use that Charlotte pick to make that upgrade. There'd be, we're going to get to the options shortly, but there's might be 4 or 5 different options that might be worth it, achievable. And if I couldn't hit on either of those, then I'd be, sitting and waiting really. But they have very few bullets left in the chamber, and if they use this one now, then they won't be able to make any moves in the offseason, really, because after the draft, they'll get access to a 2030 second round pick and a 2030 first round pick. But, with the that doesn't open up an extra pick because it's either 29 or 30 can go out, and you can't trade both of those. So, So you're really limited with what's left. But I would be trying to make the upgrade now. But there's a pretty narrow window of what you'll be able to get. And I'm not sure if Brian mentioned, but, there could be a 2024 pick swap that the Sixers could add in as well. But that's, limited value because you'd expect the Sixers to be pretty good. So
exactly.
So that's one other thing.
You basically just have to be betting on what basically the Nets were trying to do when they deferred the 2022 first-round pick to the 2023 first-round pick, which is that the Sixers could suffer an injury. The Sixers could lose James Harden potentially. Like, there are a bunch of different factors that could happen that makes that pick more valuable as a swap. But if you're trading with a team and they're selling at this deadline, they're probably not going to be better than the Sixers at any time in the next year or two. And that's really what you're kind of banking on. So I want to talk a little bit just about, like, we've established the fact that they don't have a ton to trade. We've established the fact that it is, they have some upgrades that they need to make. The market, as we've talked about a lot on the podcast, is not great for teams in the Sixers position as well. Because the fact is that most teams are not going to be selling at this deadline. I've been saying recently, people have been begging the Raptors and Bulls to blow it up because they're the only teams at this deadline that really have players that could potentially move the needle, right? Like, the Wizards don't seem to be wanting to move on from Kyle Kuzma. The Hornets have a bunch of literal slop. The Spurs kind of the same position, and we'll talk about some of those players in a little bit, but it does feel like this market is not great for contending teams, especially ones that are pick poor. But let's talk a little bit just about what you guys view as the Sixers' biggest need. So let's just say, Brian, if there's one thing you could come out of this deadline with, what would it be?
I mean, ideally, another wing. Easier said than done.
Yeah.
But I think, that's clearly the biggest need. And then if I had an honorable mention, it would be a backup big who's better than Montrez, but I'm not convinced that Doc will play him anyway. So definitely the wing for me.
Yeah, that's the thing is that, yes, in theory, a backup big who can be trusted in the playoffs, but when you have a coach who you don't know if you can trust in the playoffs, that also adds another layer to it. Yeah. I tend to agree. I think, and just to go back to what I was saying before, if I were in the Sixers position, because of the uncertainty of James Harden, how long he's going to be at the level that he's playing at, because of the fact that Joel Embiid is relatively healthy, knock on wood, right now, because of the fact that you have all of these things going on, I would be using all of the things we discussed to make, and there's no one that I'm married to on this roster for this trade deadline except for Joel Embiid, James Harden, and Tyrese Maxey. And I know that Maxey has been thrown around in trades, and there are all these ones. We talked about the Maxey for OG thing, which, I think in theory might be a better fit for what the Sixers need, but it's not something that I would do personally. But I'm looking at these last few pieces that we have as a way to, like you said, even if it's a bench wing that you can just trust for 10 to 20 minutes in a playoff game, that might work in a certain matchup if PJ Tucker or Tyrese Maxey or Tobias Harris or Melton, whatever, can't really survive in these certain matchups due to deficiencies in their game. I would like just to have the flexibility to add in other pieces. But Jason, you've talked a little bit about I've been surprised because you've thrown some guards at me. So do you think that the Sixers, if they are pursuing guards and some of the guys that we'll talk about in a little bit, do you think that it has to be guys that are scalable guards? So essentially guys that can not only play the 1 and the 2, but also can play the 3 in some lineups? Or do you think that the 3-guard lineup thing could be workable, even though it showed mixed results so far?
Yeah, I would, obviously, if you're going for a guard, I'd be looking for a bigger guard that, gives you the chance to play Harden, bigger guard, and one other smaller guard together. Because at least if you've got a guard that's 6'4", 6'5", you might be able to cover some wings. But really only bringing up those guards because there's lack of options on the wing. Like ideally, you just want an upgrade in position 6 through 9 in your rotation, and if that's through a guard, and part of that's through contract certainty as well, which we'll get to in some of my trade options later, like with Shake being potential free agent? Is there a position to make a move, swap out Shake as part of a deal to another team that might value him more? And maybe we can get someone that's under contract a bit longer, perhaps.
And the big thing with a trade like Shake, Thibault, if you're looking at someone like Shake, Thibault, Reed, or like I guess less so. I would say Thibault and Reed probably more so because you have their restricted rights after the season. If I'm correct, I believe that you have restricted rights on both of them. You're able to match any offer that is made for those players in free agency. So it's a little bit different. Shake will be unrestricted. Niang will be unrestricted, but you would acquire the bird rights for Shake if you did get him. So you could go over the cap to keep him if you're a team that really does value him. Now, once again, it's the issue that we continue to talk about, which is the fact that I think Niang and Shake and Tobias even might have proven to be too important, and any realistic upgrades that you could make at this deadline because of the fact of the market not being great for teams like the Sixers, they're not going to be any sort of massive upgrades. They might be marginal upgrades, like you said, to get guys that are under contract for longer. So let's dive into, I have a list of guys, and I want to hear some of your guys' ideas first on just players that the Sixers could generally target. Because I do agree, Jason, I've talked about this concept a lot recently of the guard / wing, which is essentially an undersized guard that can, Melton's proven to do some of that for the Sixers this year. He can guard bigger guys. He can play at the 3 sometimes. Other guys that fall into this category are like Bruce Brown, Alex Caruso. I'm not saying those guys are gettable at this deadline necessarily, but those are kind of Gary Payton II, guys that can play up due to the fact that they're such good defenders on the ball, off the ball. They have a lot of strength, and they can kind of fit with teams because of the fact that it's essentially impossible. When we're hearing about like OG Anunoby getting 3 first-round picks in a trade potentially, like whether we believe that or not, like that's kind of what the market looks like for these really high caliber wings. And the Sixers just don't have the ammo to make those kind of trades. So let's start with Bryan. Bryan, who are some guys just off the top of your head that are guards or wings that you think that the Sixers could realistically acquire? And I'll tell you what category I put these guys in, because I have a bunch of different categories, and then I'll give my thoughts on them as well.
Okay. Yeah. So, again, going back to the salary matching thing, I want to rule out a couple guys just right off the bat.
Yes.
Like the Eric Gordon. I know we've been linked to him a bunch dating back to the draft and free agency, but he just makes too much money. It's really hard to match his contract if you're not setting out Tobias. The same thing with Bojan Bogdanovic. Also, The Pistons are apparently asking for an unprotected first-round pick for him, which the Sixers can't offer. So, if my targets sound underwhelming, this is why.
Exactly.
I'm looking really, if you package Furkan and Matisse together, I believe you can bring back $11.8 million in salary. And then if you add, Jaden Springer or Paul Reed, you can get up to 14, 15 million. But I just don't see a realistic way you're getting into the 18, 19, $20 million range without including Tobias or PJ Tucker or anything like that, which I think would be difficult. So, I know Cam Reddish is a guy who's come up as a possible target because the Knicks seem like they're just ready to get rid of him. I don't know that he necessarily makes a difference on the Sixers team. You're betting on the talent and you're betting on him being, I guess, a third. It's not just a second draft guy, but a third draft guy. But,
yeah, I think Jason's laughing because he knows I'm the biggest Cam Reddish fan in the world.
Yeah, sure, you're betting on the talent, but he's also going to be a restricted free agent this summer, and I imagine he's going to want more than the Sixers are willing to offer him. So it does feel like it would just be a rental.
And also, I just want to point out about Cam Reddish, and I've said this time and time again with Cam Reddish, I don't think there's a single team that Cam Reddish takes from good team to great team, from bad team to middling team to good team. So if that's the case, why wouldn't you just wait until the offseason to try to make him an offer? Because the Knicks aren't going to match anyway. Right. Unless you think there's a team that's you really like Cam and there's a team that's dying to get him, there's really no reason to even make that kind of trade right now. I don't really think that. I think he's a bit overrated overall, but I just think that the only thing in theory is that if there's no other wings that you can get, at least he's a 6'8" body that can occasionally hit some shots and play some defense. Like that's the thing that you're looking at here with a guy like Cam Reddish.
Yeah, totally. I know Reggie Bullock is shooting like absolute garbage this year, but he is at least in the money range that the Sixers can afford. And maybe if the Mavs are looking to stiffen their defense, like Furk and Matisse for Bullock alone might be enough to actually make that trade happen.
Sure. Yeah, well, and also in fairness, the Mavericks have liked Thibault in the past. That's a bigger part that is the two teams I know that have had three teams, Chicago, Portland, and Dallas are the three teams that have had some interest in Thibault that we know of in the past, whether it's due to connections like Eversley in Chicago or whatever it is. Now, maybe they could look at it as the same way and they say, well, we're waiting until the offseason to make our big move anyway, so we could just make him an offer in restricted free agency with our MLE. And if the Sixers don't match that, which actually Daryl Morey has a history of just letting guys kind of walk in those situations, then it's possible that they could just say, let's just wait until the offseason and try to get access to our MLE and do that. So to sum up, I had the guys who make too much money list. My guys who make too much money were Eric Gordon, Bojan Bogdanovic, the two guys you named. Buddy Hield is another guy who's been tied to the Sixers a lot, but he just makes too much unless Tobias is moving. And I don't think that his skill set, even though it would help the Sixers a lot, if you're removing Tobias from the situation, it makes the wing rotation even worse. It doesn't make sense. Tim Hardaway Jr. and Gary Trent Jr. So those were the guys that have been in theory Sixers targets before that really probably wouldn't work in any kind of situation like this. So, and then the other guys that you mentioned on there were Cam Reddish. I had him as a young upside swing, quote unquote. He's still 23. I'm not a Cam Reddish believer, but there are a lot of Cam Reddish believers out there. So, and that's just like a real talent. And then I had in my buy low category, I had Reggie Bullock. So Jason, why don't you give us a few of your guard or wing names, and then we'll talk about them.
All right. So obviously Crowder's one that I've brought up before, so we can, we don't need to go into that in great detail right now. But
the only thing I want to say about Jay Crowder, the Suns are, I know that this is all bargaining in public right now, but the Suns are psychotic for thinking that they would get anything even remotely close to what they want, which is two of three things they said: a good rotation player, a young player, or a first round pick. And they're not going to, they're not even going to get a first for Jay Crowder with this situation. So that's another buy low guy.
Oh, absolutely. And I saw someone comment on that on Twitter. They said, well, Crowder is a solid rotation player.
Yeah.
How do they expect to get a first and a good pick, a good young player after that? But
exactly.
Yeah. So Crowder's a guy I had on my list. Alec Burks, and one guy that's even more interesting. It was brought up to me by Marty Teller, who former friend of the podcast.
Marty's still a friend of the podcast. He's just checked out from the NBA, so he can't play anything.
So he mentioned Daylon Wright, which I think what you were referencing when you were speaking about a guard. So on the paper, it's we've got our guard rotation covered, but that dude is averaging 4 steals per 36 minutes or something.
Wow.
At the moment. Is incredible. So I would see as a possible replacement for Shake in the rotation, maybe Shake goes out in a deal in addition to something else. The beauty about Wright is he's under contract for $7 million or so next year as well. So you've got some certainty. He can handle the ball. He's a very, very good guard defender, and he's 6'5". So he could be paired with Maxey in some certain lineups. He doesn't have to be handling the ball like a true point guard too much, but he's an excellent guard defender who won't let you down in the playoffs. He defended really well for Atlanta last year.
He did, yeah, in that first round series against the Heat.
Yeah, so he's a guy there that worth looking at, and one other guy that I really don't know what's going on with him is Robert Covington. I know he makes a little bit more, but he's shooting like crap this year. I don't know if he's injured, but he was on fire after the trade last year. But I don't know if he's still that guy. But him as well as Bullock, it might be difficult to make a direct trade with each of those guys. But Dallas are looking to upgrade, and maybe they're in the market for Boyan or Eric Gordon or Mike Conley or something like that. And then Bullock might be a guy that goes out in one of those trades along with Dwight Powell and, could get involved in a 3-team trade. And same with Covington. If they're trying to upgrade their point guard and get Conley or Van Vliet or Rozier or something like that, then he's out of the rotation, Covington. So he probably goes out, and the other tanking team might look to move them.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the two guards you brought up first, which were Alec Burks, former Sixer that only played half a season for us. Daryl Morey famously didn't want to pay him, and he walked to the Knicks. Actually, Alec Burks is the kind of guy and he was a Marty Teller favorite from a few years ago before we even traded for him. And he's the kind of guy that I would view similar and I mean, obviously they're very different players, but in terms of like, if you're looking to upgrade that Shake part of the rotation, I feel like Alec Burks would be that kind of ideal guy. They're very similar players. Shake's a little bit better as a finisher and a playmaker, but Burks is a better shooter. He is overall, I would say that he is probably a better self-creator than Shake. And defensively, I think he holds up a little bit better, especially since he's left the Sixers. He's had some actual, like, real defensive, like, he's been like a positive on the Pistons and the Knicks since he's left those teams. So Burks is interesting because he doesn't make too much money. He can theoretically play the 1, 2, and the 3. Obviously, when he has to be the true point guard, it's a disaster like it was for the Knicks last year. But when he is that 2-3 combo guard that can function as your 6-man, maybe running backup units with Maxey, I don't hate that because I think that he has had he showed in that Atlanta series a few years ago. He had that game 1 where it's just like you catch Alec Burks on the right night and he looks like a superstar. Like he can put up 30 on a random night and swing the fortunes of a playoff game or potentially series. And I think the fact that he holds up defensively, I like that about him. I wonder what Detroit's price for him really is going to be, because I think right now they're holding firm, but they do this all the time with the guys that they have. They did it with Kelly Olynyk. They did it with Jeremy Grant. And then eventually they ended up making trades for those guys later than we had all expected. But Troy Weaver's way that he kind of goes about this is essentially that he is looking for deals where he can maximize the return on those guys. And then last second, it's possible that he changes his mind and says, okay, we can trade Alec Burks for whatever. Is Burks under contract for next year, or is he an expiring? I honestly can't remember off the top of my head.
He has a team option.
So that's another thing that's something that we'll talk about with what Morey looks for at these deadlines. But one of the things that he always values is guys that have not necessarily they're under contract, but the team has an option. It's non-guaranteed. All of the guys that he's acquired so far for the Sixers, basically, you're looking at George Hill, DeAnthony Melton, Seth Curry, all of them have some sort of team control moving forward. And I think that's something that, like, I don't think he's going to make a trade for a guy that is on an expiring contract. So DeLon Wright and Alec Burks make a lot of sense. A guy like Jay Crowder, I would be more skeptical unless there's some sort of trade and extension that's happening. And then the guys that are locked up for next year or 2 years, or they have a team option after the year, probably more likely, unless they're like really don't make a lot of money, unless they're making like $5 million or less, and it really is a flyer like a Cam Reddish or whoever that hasn't really been in the nature of the player that he has acquired so far for the Sixers. So before we get into anything else, I just want to say this is the end of the free portion. If you want to listen to the entire episode, link in the description, sign up for the You Know Ball Patreon, and we will be talking more about these guards, wings, and then we'll go into backup centers and then some other options that the Sixers could potentially have. So check that out if you have not already signed up.